Hey there, students. Tom Richey here. Remember to take care of yourself and your immune system. Wash your hands and make sure to drink plenty of water. Tonight, this evening, we're going to be talking about the United States as a democratic republic. And of course, I always forget to turn that volume off there. We've got some good people here. We've got, let's see, Michelle and Annie and Versi. Good to see y'all. Versi from New Jersey and Justin. Okay. So with that, interesting. All right, y'all have got some of y'all sound like you're getting ready for AP government, but some of this that we're going to do this evening could be very relevant for AP government. Let me first cough real quick. And the World Health Organization says that you're supposed to dab when you do that. Hey there, Shane and Molly. So as far as this goes, we're going to be discussing this evening the United States as a democratic republic. And with that, this whole idea of the United States as a democratic republic, let's think in terms of Jacksonian democracy. So let's go ahead and when you have questions this evening, prioritize the period of Jacksonian democracy in the Antebellum period. And what I want to go into is the change of government that we experience and really a change in our political culture, kind of taking a deep look at this. I've got a video where I go into a lot of these things, a couple of them, but I think sometimes doing this from a with a live audience. And James, good to see you here. You always have great questions for me. So with that, now another thing I want to note is we're going to take a week off next week. Okay, now of course 1 week is just like any other right now, but technically when we scheduled these broadcasts, next week is my spring break, and so we originally had planned to take it off. Now we're also getting a major announcement from the College Board tomorrow, so that's going to give us some time to kind of regroup, let all of that set in, and then we will be back the following week. So note that the next broadcast, and that was planned, that we're going to be back on Tuesday, April 14th, okay, for webinar 7, where we'll go into the causes of the Civil War will be our focus, okay? So we will take a week off, and the updates y'all are asking about for the AP test, those updates are going to be coming out tomorrow. Teachers are supposed to be getting kind of a sneak preview tonight. So yeah, we are still in the dark, but we'll have some time to digest that, and then we'll be back on April 14th. So with that, let's go ahead and kind of get into, what I think is something that is very important, especially since, when you're going toward the American Civil War, something that doesn't really get discussed quite as much is what did it mean as far as a transition from an aristocratic republic to a democratic republic. And of course, this is part of the AP government overlap. This stuff will be good for you, even if you're taking AP government next year, which a lot of students who take APUSH will go on to take AP US government and politics. So let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen with you and start talking about what does Jacksonian democracy mean, and also what is the difference between an aristocratic republic and a democratic republic. Okay, I think these are very important distinctions. And so when we think about this, that our republic has changed quite a bit. Okay, so when you look at at 1789 to 2018, you had, James Madison wrote the Constitution. And of course, if we think about 1818, James Monroe was president. James Madison had just been our president. But when you think about, our political culture, our political leaders, somebody like James Madison, I could never see James Madison getting elected president today. He was just way too nerdy. He talked over people's heads. He was somebody that was kind of shy. When you read like Federalist 10 and Federalist 51, they're not as accessible as Alexander Hamilton's writings. Alexander Hamilton was someone who was, when you're reading like Federalist 70 or Federalist 78 or Federalist 84, it's something that, it flows a lot better as far as something that just reaches out to regular people. Not so much for Madison. Now, Madison is known as the father of our Constitution. And so, he's the one who wrote our Constitution primarily. Of course, there was a convention, but our Constitution was designed for a particular type of government, that's something that would have elements of democracy in it, but not something that would be democratic per se, So it was something to try to create something of a balancing act between aristocracy and democracy. And so going from there, that the antebellum period, okay, so when we think about this antebellum period that spans, like, of course, I never like to talk about numbered periods and a push, because when you think about numbered periods, it cuts this period, it slices this period in half. And really, this is, in most historical surveys, this is going to be a period that is very important, going from 1820 to 1860, from the Missouri Compromise to the American Civil War. And so when I look at the antebellum period, now, of course, when we look at the march of democracy through U.S. history, it certainly started before this period, and it continued until, continued well after this period. But I think that there was more change during this time than at any other time. You're looking at this era of Henry Clay versus Andrew Jackson. And so when we think about, going from like dominant figures in antebellum politics, you're going from Clay to Jackson to Lincoln. Clay's someone who was a Westerner and had a common touch, but still very aristocratic in his thinking. Now, when we look at 1820, the era of good feelings. Now, how did this happen? How was everybody on the same page, except for this one person from New Hampshire that didn't seem to be too crazy about James Monroe? There's an old myth that was told to me when I was in school, that there was an elector who said, "I can't bear the thought of anyone other than George Washington receiving unanimous acclaim from the Electoral College." But there's no historical basis for that. And also, look at where this vote is coming from. It's coming from New England. But essentially, James Monroe's won just about everybody over. And so in 1820, now, how was the president selected in 1820? I'm not going to go so far as to say elected, but what they would do is, since the Federalist Party was basically done for, just gone for all practical purposes, still a few people in the Congress, but not a national party anymore, the House Republican caucus, now remember, this is the Jeffersonian or Democratic Republican Party we're talking about, that they got together, the folks in the House of Representatives who represented the party, and they said, you know what, we all support James Monroe's reelection. And they all say, you know what, we agree with that. And so the several states and their electors, and there really wasn't much in terms of democratic voting. Like, we didn't necessarily have a direct sort of ballot for the president. Okay, so what you're seeing here now in 1860, it's like, whoa, okay, that's where we see democracy. Okay, that's what democracy looks like. This is what aristocracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. Now let's go into a few things that changed here. Okay, I'm going to go into Jacksonian democracy and what is happening here. Okay, so when we go from 1820 and then we go into the 1820s and 1824, that when, in the 1824 election, we're looking at predominantly like voters, they elect the members of their state legislature. Okay, so presidential electors were initially chosen by the state legislature, kind of like U.S. senators were initially, well, oops, my water, okay, but it didn't spill, so we're okay. That senators were initially chosen by the state legislature. So voters would elect the legislature, of course, voters generally that own property and stuff like that. And then the legislators, they pick the presidential electors, just like they pick the Senate. So this is the old system of indirect election, indirect balloting. Now, what you're going to see with the new system is a direct election. Okay, that's where we have democracy. Now, y'all may wonder, like, how is it that a candidate can not win the popular vote, but they can win the Electoral College? Now, really, we don't have a national election for president. We don't have like a national Democratic election, but we do have 51 distinct Democratic elections for president. And so it is a federal election where every state has its own election for president. But every state in the union has voters who vote directly, and whoever gets the votes in that state, whoever gets those votes from that state, gets that state's electoral votes. However, that state has decided to apportion them, which every state except for Nebraska and Maine does a winner take all. So we see here that there is now a more democratic kind of system, that we see that the people are more involved personally in picking the president. And so now by 1860, every state except my state of South Carolina was having direct balloting for president. Now, South Carolina, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, they started the Democratic direct election for president. But, as far as that goes, by the time of the Civil War, everybody was there except for South Carolina. And so going from there, we see that this whole idea. Now, this is where, like in the 1824 election, you had Andrew Jackson got the plurality of the electoral vote. He got the plurality of the popular vote. Now, remember, the popular vote doesn't matter that much, okay? So, that's really constitutionally, it means nothing. But it's something to take into consideration. And you see where Jackson got the plurality of the electoral vote. Now, Jackson also was the only candidate you can see here that really had a following that was more than sectional, okay? So every other candidate, you can identify where they are strongest. Whereas for Jackson, you see that he has supporters from New Jersey to Pennsylvania to Illinois to Louisiana to South Carolina. So, he really was not only the candidate who got the hiccups. He may have had, I'm sure Andrew Jackson had the hiccup at some point, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. And so with Jackson, it's like, hey, this is something that he should be the president, even though now by Democratic terms, even though he didn't get the majority, he should be the president. Now, in 1825, the House of Representatives gets together because nobody got a majority in the Electoral College. And what we see here is Clay had been, Clay had to drop out because the top three get into the balloting for the House. Now, note what happened to all three of those states that voted for Clay, plus a few, they're voting for Adams. Okay, so what you see here is that, the way this works is that if there is nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, then it goes to the House of Representatives where each state delegation votes with one vote. So if we ever see that happening again, we would see that, like California, for example, all of the representatives from California, they'd have one vote. And then Wyoming, with the one representative at large from Wyoming, would have one vote. So that would cause quite a stir today, I'm sure, if that were ever to happen. But it's something that, you see where, looking backward, nobody saw a problem with this, okay, with this kind of like horse trading that went on here. But what happened was Henry Clay's votes all go to John Quincy Adams. Now, we're not going to find any kind of written agreement, but when John Quincy Adams becomes the president, and then Henry Clay all of a sudden is named Secretary of State, and then we see here that, it just so happens that the last three secretaries of state have become the president, okay, which actually you look at Jefferson, that Jefferson came from the vice presidency, but had also been Secretary of State. So when you think about that when you had, John Quincy Adams is the sixth president, and four of these six presidents had been Secretary of State beforehand, and one of those presidents was George Washington, who had, didn't have a chance to, then you can see where Henry Clay is becoming the the Secretary of State. And it's just almost like this whole aristocratic thing that, like, what, Henry Clay, you put me in the presidency, you're next. Now, in an aristocracy, that doesn't necessarily matter. But in a democracy, that's what gets, that gets titled as a corrupt bargain. Now, John C. Calhoun, who's not going to be known during the antebellum period for his advocacy of democracy necessarily, was feeling very democratic after this happened because he ran for vice president, which he saw as another stepping stone. And he believed that, he's like, look, that, he's trumpeting this Jacksonian line that says that there was a corrupt bargain here, and this should not be acceptable in our politics. Now, Again, when we look at the corrupt bargain, we're looking at something that backward looking, it didn't necessarily, seem to be that big of a, that big of a problem. But when we think about this, that our republic was founded as an aristocratic and national republic. And I'm going to say that before 1820, it pretty much functioned along those lines. Okay. And then when we look at, the antebellum period, we see this tension. Okay. Is this an aristocratic republic or a democratic republic? Is this a federal, is this a federal union, or is this a nation? And I would say that after the Civil War, the United States is much more democratic and national in those terms. Okay. And so when we think about this, what makes a republic? Okay. So we have in our society a republican form of government. Okay. We have a republican form of government. So an aristocratic republic and a democratic republic, remember when we compare, we want to have similarities and differences, right? We want to have similarities and differences. And so when we look at an aristocratic republic and a democratic republic, the similarity is that the government's authority comes from the people. Then when we look at an aristocratic republic, elites govern on behalf of the people. Okay, so the elites are the ones who are governing, they're making the decisions on our behalf. Whereas in a democratic republic, the people are actively involved in governing. Now, I think with our current crisis right now with the coronavirus, I think we're seeing some elements of aristocracy, and I think the majority of Americans are okay with that. Listen to the doctors, listen to the health professionals, listen to the politicians who are saying that, you need to comply with government orders. I mean, it's a very aristocratic mentality. So I would say that in times of crisis, we kind of revert back to, in some ways, this aristocratic republic where, there are these people who know more than we do, who are making a lot of these decisions for us. And so a democratic republic, the people are actively involved. Now, when we look at an aristocratic republic, we see where a small elite visibly governs. There are property requirements for voting generally. The people without property are seen as people who don't have a stake in the government and therefore don't really have any business voting because they don't have a horse in the race. They don't have something invested. And so indirect presidential balloting, that in an aristocratic republic, you would elect somebody like a president indirectly because there's no requirement that it be democratic. Okay. So as far as that goes, then we're going to look at going to the next thing is that you don't have popular campaigning. Okay. So you don't have popular campaigning, and rhetoric is kept within respectable limits. Okay. That basically there now, of course, you've got some, very, pointed rhetoric even in the 1790s, with the Adams administration. But if we're looking from an aristocratic perspective, there are lines that are not crossed. And then this is where the corrupt bargain comes in, is that you've got consensus and deal making among elites and between groups. So if we're looking at the corrupt bargain from the perspective of an aristocratic republic, we're seeing that it's not really outside the norm, that deal making and consensus, that's what you should do. Now, when we go to a democratic republic, we see here that all citizens participate politically. We typically will not see property requirements because, in a democracy, it means that everybody, should really have an equal say regardless of their means. Now, this is one thing we were talking about in the AP government broadcast earlier, is when we think about, when we consider the idea, okay, so let's see, when we consider the idea of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Okay. So when we think about all men are created equal, then, we think about this idea that is in our Declaration of Independence, but it never appears in the original Constitution. If you think about this, the idea, the word, if correct me if I'm wrong, but, the original Constitution never says anything about equality. Okay. So it's the 14th Amendment where we see equal protection of laws. Okay, so we see equal protection of the laws. Okay, so that's something that, is kind of a completion of the Constitution as a democratic document. And so we see direct presidential balloting. We see direct presidential balloting in this case rather than indirect, and popular campaigning. Now, what we see here, and this is something that I've always made this argument, some people may disagree with me on that, and that's fine. But when we talk about demagoguery, okay, demagoguery is like when there are politicians that pander to the masses. Okay, there are politicians that pander to the masses, and by pandering, it means you're telling people what they want to hear to get their votes. And to me, this is something that is just, when you have a democracy, you're going to have demagogues, you're going to have pandering, and it's going to happen. It's one of those side effects. I mean, democracy is not a perfect form of government by any means. So then you look also, and you can kind of understand what's going on with with what we would call like, partisanship, winner take all. We've got this polarized society. Then we're in a situation where you can see where it's very difficult. Now, of course, this coronavirus thing has made it possible all of a sudden to make a deal. And that, I think, goes back to what I was saying about when you see like, wow, the Congress, like Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump were actually able to make a deal about something. Well, there you go. You would see here to where in this current crisis, we are reverting back, at least for a period of time, into this mindset of an aristocratic republic, because typically we don't see them making deals with each other. So with that, I want to think about this, like where we're thinking about some things that, if you're looking for evidence, okay, during this time of the development of democracy and really the maintenance of aristocracy. You can see the 1820 presidential election, the Missouri Compromise. That's one of those things. Any of these compromises, when you think about Henry Clay, Henry Clay is, I think really kind of the poster boy of this idea of an aristocratic republic, that every time that there's a problem, we compromise. In the 1830s, no Texas annexation. Also, we see the gag rule where, Congress said, we're not going to talk about slavery. It's too controversial. So we're not going to get into that. And then the Compromise of 1850. Now you start to see as it goes on, Jackson's bank veto. Now he had constitutional reasons, but, he also talks about democracy, where he sees the bank as something that is, the bank that is something that is against the masses of the people. That it keeps certain people rich. It makes up some people rich and keeps others poor. And it's something that does this as part of the government or semi-part of the government or whatever. But this is something that Jackson said, no. You look at the spoil system, where Jackson's like, hey, we won the election, we'll fire everybody, put our own people in there. Now, another thing that we want to note, you remember, democracy is not something that is inherently moral, okay? That this whole idea of winner take all, that when you think about Indian removal was a very democratic thing. The majority of folks in Congress wanted the Indians from the Southeast to be removed. They were removed. Now, their rights were not considered. In a republic, you think about like deal making and consensus between groups, but the Indian Removal Act is an example of a majority faction, saying that this minority group is going to have to move hundreds of miles from their homes on a forced march. And so then when you look at Texas annexation, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you look at Dred Scott, where basically the faction that had a majority on the Supreme Court, they just got to do whatever they wanted. The 1860 presidential election was certainly not about consensus and deal making. So with that, let me go ahead and go into the Q&A. Let's see what we've got here. We've got a few questions here, so let's see. All right, so would you talk about the Great Awakening? Okay, so Shane, as far as the Great Awakening, I think that we could talk about the Great Awakenings as being democratic, because one thing that you see here is, especially in the Second Great Awakening, with the emphasis on personal conversion, that this is something where, the Great Awakenings, both of them are evangelical religion. Okay, evangelical Christianity emerges from both Great Awakenings stronger. Okay, so before the first Great Awakening, for example, you had the Anglican Church was pretty much in charge of was pretty much had a monopoly in most of these colonies. And so we see evangelical groups like the Baptists and the Methodists. Now let's think about this. In my lectures on colonial New England, I actually talk about like Baptist, for example. Okay, I live in South Carolina. This place is full of Baptists. Now when you look worldwide, that Baptists, you don't find a whole lot of Baptists in Europe. There were these Anabaptist groups in Europe, but they never really took hold. When you look at a worldwide map, you find Baptists in the United States and in places where the United States has sent a lot of missionaries. Those are the only two places in the world where you find like a large segment of Baptist and evangelical Christians in general. And there's something about it, when you think about the Baptist faith and the Baptist church and the way that they do things, that, it's like you don't baptize the infant. That person should be able to make a choice. Okay, so when you think about that, that is a very American way of looking at religion, right? You can't make that decision for that baby. They need to be able to make that decision. Now, also, Baptist churches are notably independent, so they don't have a church hierarchy, and the pastor of the church in a Baptist church is employed by the congregation, invited by the congregation, and if a Baptist preacher upsets some key members of the congregation, they can send that person on and they bring somebody else in. So when you think about the Baptist religion, it is very, very compatible. Like this religion that really was a small minority in Europe found very fertile soil in the United States because it's very individualistic. It doesn't have a hierarchy. Also, Baptists place a high premium on the individual interpretation of the Bible, not the interpretation of the Bible by church leaders. You need to get by my daughter. You want to say, hey, Caroline?
Hi.
All right. So there's my daughter, Caroline. She's actually learned a little history this week. What did you learn about? Who were those people in Vermont with that funny flag?
The Green Mountain Boys.
The Green Mountain Boys. She learned about the Green Mountain Boys this week. And surprise, it's not real wood. It's a cloth background. Makes me look like, I'm in a wooden barn or something like that. But I'm really not. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's something that I think is very fascinating when you start exploring the second Great Awakening, especially. Now the first Great Awakening was rooted in more of a Calvinistic approach. Sinners in the hands of an angry God, that you're like God's got you and it's by God's mercy if you're saved or not. Now, here's the thing. Let me actually show you a little something. I've got a lecture on the second Great Awakening, but I want to bring up something because I made some wordles a while back, and I think that this is very telling when we think about this. Okay, that I've got a wordle here. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you real quick. So here is a wordle about sinners in the hands of an angry God, Jonathan Edwards. Okay, so what we're seeing here with Jonathan Edwards: God, wrath, hell, power. We assume God's power. Hand, the hand of God. Now, nothing. Okay, when we think about this, I think when I see that word nothing, I'm inferring that that's, there's nothing you can do about this. Okay, that Jonathan Edwards is focused on God's power, God's wrath. You are in his hands hanging by a thread. Now, let's look at a wordle from a sermon by Charles G. Finney. Okay, now this, of course, God's in there. Carol, can't do chips while I'm broadcasting. Okay, you can't do chips while I'm broadcasting. All right. Okay, so as far as that goes, you see here, of course, God, salvation. Now here we see this is a sermon on reprobation. Okay, somebody's a reprobate, which we don't use that word very often. It's not a nice word. If somebody calls you a reprobate, it's not a compliment. That's not somebody, that's like a person that makes a 1 on the APUSH exam. Might be a reprobate. Certainly not somebody that makes a 4 or 5, right? But Finney's sermon, we see reprobate, reprobates, reprobated. We see here reprobation, wicked, okay, saved, willing, okay. What I think is important here is this word willing, okay, this word wicked, this word believe, okay. So what we're seeing here is he's still talking about God and eternal damnation in hell, but what he's focusing on, it's you, okay. You have a decision to make. So whereas Jonathan Edwards is focused on God, okay, he's focusing on God and the traits of God and how you're at his mercy. What we see with the Second Great Awakening is that you are able to make a difference in your own salvation. And this is a viewpoint known as Arminianism. You don't necessarily need to know that particular viewpoint for the AP exam, but this idea of Arminianism, which actually is very prevalent in Methodism. Okay, so, in Methodism, that's, part of this idea that like God, is all powerful, but God is allowing you to make a choice, okay? That, God is here to save you, but you are the person who, agrees with God and cooperates with God in living a Christian life. So that's something that I think is really important. Yeah, so we can definitely make ties between the development of religion and democracy, okay, through the Great Awakenings. Now, also, we want to note that the Second Great Awakening was the catalyst, was kind of the starting point for antebellum reform, okay? So when we start to see movements like abolitionism and temperance, those were motivated by these sermons where, we don't need all this wickedness in this country. So slavery is wicked. Alcohol is wicked. We got to get rid of them. Whereas before that, we don't see, nearly as much of that. And of course, that is also those movements which were very popular among middle-class women. They indirectly brought about the women's suffrage movement. So that's something to note there. And so with that, we're going to note here something about, the elections that we need to know about. Okay, so I would say in terms of the shaping of American democracy, I would say, 1824, 1848, and 1840. Now, the 1824 election, that's the one that Jackson loses, corrupt bargain, all of that. And 1828, that's where Jackson wins, okay? And so Jackson becomes president for a couple terms. He's succeeded by Van Buren. The economy, I almost dropped my keyboard. So the economy, gets pretty bad. Now, that's something that's going to be very interesting in an election year this year, where the economy is faltering right now. It's going to be interesting to see how that turns out in November. The economy is always a big election issue. And so the economy was bad, but also the Whigs, okay? The Whig Party was not inherently democratic, okay? But by 1840, they realized that we need to be a bit more democratic if we want to get elected. And because the whole point of a political party, right, is to get elected to office and to hold political power. And so you had in 1840, the Whigs launched the log cabin and hard cider campaign, okay? Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So, the log cabin and hard cider campaign, basically almost the equivalent. If someone were running today and if you elect me, I'm going to give you free beer. Like that's almost, it's the same kind of tone there. So, and William Henry Harrison, who was the general who fought at Tippecanoe, he was not, he was not born in a log cabin. But they decided, since Jackson was born in a log cabin and William Henry Harrison is most famous for his victory over the Indians out west, we can say that he was born in a log cabin, okay? So with that, all right, stay hydrated, kids. And so with that, I would say the 1840 election is pretty important. And also we see that a lot more people are voting by that time. So by 1840, we see that this whole like democratic culture of the United States has really taken root here. And that's where you see kind of in the 1840s, this transition where that gag rule on slavery in Congress that seemed so, just a given in the 1830s, no more. Okay. Manifest destiny. Hey, moving west is going to cause problems with our neighbors in Mexico. So yeah, this mentality is really taking root there. So as far as that goes, James, the question you have here is why didn't we get direct election for senators earlier, possibly in the age of Jackson until the 17th Amendment? I'm going to say that really before the progressive era, nobody really saw a problem in the sense that, and we want to note what I was saying earlier, that American democracy and just the evolution of the American Republic is something that is constantly ongoing and sometimes maybe a little bit of a roller coaster. It's going to be interesting to see. We never know what kind of historic times we're living in, but any of you who are adults, I'm in my late 30s, and there's never been a time in my life where the government has told people essentially like stay in your homes, don't go to school, don't get out for non-essentials. This is really something like my neighborhood pool is closed by order of the governor. So it's just the government is very active right now. And so what is going to happen as a result of that? Like, do we become, do we just come out of this whole thing like just as democratic as we were? Or do we come out of this less democratic than we were? And more, more reliant on government. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how all of this plays out. And so the thing is, what we want to note here is direct election of senators came about during the progressive era in response to muckraking. Okay, there was actually like this, and I've got a YouTube video on the progressive era amendments. If any of y'all want to check that out, I've got a YouTube video on that. And with the progressive era amendments, you look at a lot of these were motivated partly by muckraking, these journalists who were using these sensational stories to create a public outcry. And so what happened was this, don't laugh here, because this was a series of articles that was actually published in Cosmopolitan magazine, which today, Cosmopolitan magazine, you see it in the grocery store and it's usually got like a little like thing in front of it so the kids don't see the cover. So that's the thing, that it used to be just a general readership magazine and eventually just evolved into a racy magazine with a predominantly female audience. But at that time, it actually had like an old man on the cover, and the article or series of articles was called The Treason of the Senate. And so when you look at the 17th Amendment, it was basically the result of this public outcry based on this muckraking. So in this muckraking piece, the person writing portrayed the Senate as very corrupt and portrayed senators as basically having bought their offices. Now, one thing that, the progressives, they thought that the 17th Amendment is going to make our government more democratic and more responsive to the people. But what I always tell people is go look up your senators and find out where their money's coming from. And what you're going to see if you go to fec.gov is that most of your senators, like the money's coming from like out of state, like large out of state donors. So it's kind of the irony of that, what is more democracy? And this is an interesting question here, especially, right now, but is more democracy always necessarily a good thing? So, it was definitely a trade-off that we see that as a result of the 17th Amendment, our senators are much more beholden than they used to be to out-of-state interest, whereas, the appointment by the legislature made them accountable to the people of their state. So it's kind of interesting here, but I would say here that it's because there was not a public outcry until, the age of mass media and muckraking, created that outcry. And then you see the Constitution. Keep in mind that it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. Here's another thing, that if you think about that, in order for a constitutional amendment to happen, then unless you're going to have a convention of states, which we've never had ever since the Constitutional Convention, you would have to have it passed by 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states. Now, are you going to have 2/3 of the Senate vote to send that amendment to the states without a massive popular outcry? Probably not. And so, this was something that happened, was kind of a fixture of the progressive era. All right, this is a random question. Okay, so Molly, random questions are fine. I graded AP Euro exams for 8 years. So, I did spend several years grading AP exams, yes. And so the election of 1840, I would say that, the 1840 election, when you look at the number of people who voted, it's, you're getting to where, Jackson, when Jackson, the election of 1824, for example, only had about 350,000, like 300 to 400,000 voters, whereas you had over 1 million voters in 1828. And then you have, I think I'm giving you the right stuff, but by 1840, voting is becoming like part of the American political culture. And this very unique political culture we have, like people from other countries are like, why are people running for president more than a year before the election? I mean, this is something that is a very American thing. Like, right now, it's currently April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. We are 7 months away from the presidential election. Okay, so we're 7 months away from the election, but we are, we are campaigning pretty hard for president. And so, of course, that's been kind of suspended for right now for all practical purposes because of mass gatherings. But, our presidential election season, it starts about 18 months before. I mean, we spend almost half of our time in presidential campaign season, and that's unique to the United States. A lot of other countries have laws that say that you can only campaign this far out from the election, like 6 weeks or 2 months or something like that. So I would say that the 1840 election, that's where you see this. Now, the Whig policies, goals, and their demise. Okay, so and Molly, I actually have a video on both Great Awakenings. Okay, so there's a first Great Awakening video and a second Great Awakening video. And so with that, let's talk about the Whigs. Okay, so let's think about like what's going on here. This would be a good time. Michelle is asking us about the development of the second two-party system in particular. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and let's get into the second two-party system. And I think we're finished with that. All right. And let's see, we're finished with, well, maybe not. Okay, so as far as this goes, let's go ahead and look at the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. And what we want to understand is there was only a 2-year period. Like in 1840, that's another hallmark because there was a 2-year period where the Whigs, like in the 1840 election, the Whigs had the presidency, the Senate, and the House, okay, which the Democratic Party had that situation a lot during the antebellum period, but the Whigs only had that one brief period. The only times that they were able to elect a president was when they put a war hero up, okay, so in 1840, William Henry Harrison. In 1848, Zachary Taylor, okay, so which both of them died in office and were they were the first 2 presidents to die in office, and they were both generals. And so in order to get somebody into the White House, they had to get somebody who was a celebrity for all practical purposes. And so when we look at this, we want to understand, like, why were the Whigs, a minority party, really, in a sense there? They never were able to become the majority party. And so with that, what we want to note here is we've got the Whigs, with their leader, Henry Clay. The Democrats, now, of course, they had other leaders, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster. The Democrats had Andrew Jackson and, of course, others. Federalism. Okay, so what we want to note about Clay is Clay's party is very Hamiltonian. Okay, when we think about the mindset, we want to think about kind of Jefferson and Hamilton part two. And this is a period of time. Now, the antebellum period is very like Democratic, Jeffersonian. Now, the Republican Party is going to be the majority party during the Gilded Age after the Civil War. So Henry Clay, you can kind of argue, may have been a bit ahead of his time. Now, Jackson and the Democrats were very, on most matters, pretty states' rights oriented. Okay. Now, nullification, that was something where, which nullification is kind of difficult here because a lot of the way that people thought about states' rights, a lot of the states' rights folks at that time, there were two branches there. The nullifiers were kind of a branch that, kind of branched off from what was the predominant states' rights philosophy. The predominant states' rights philosophy during the antebellum period was that states retain a great deal of their sovereignty and they have the right to secede from the union if they want to, but they can't nullify a law of the union within their own borders as long as they're in the union. Okay, so that's basically, when you look at nullification, Jackson in most cases was, a states' rights guy, but then of course, again, we have to note that Jackson wasn't a political theorist. He was a general turned politician. Now, attitude toward the common man, the Whigs tended to have a lot of elitism about them, okay? And then the Jacksonians were more democratic, okay? They believed in the common man. Now, because the Whigs were elitists, they look at the common man and they're like, that person doesn't need to, that person's got something wrong. Like we need to take the alcohol away from them because they can't manage it. You look at the 15-gallon Act in Massachusetts, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. During the antebellum period, they passed the 15-gallon Act, basically said that a saloon wasn't allowed to have more than 15 gallons of liquor on hand at any given time. It was a state regulation. Now, why 15 gallons? Because that way they'd have to close when it ran out. So they couldn't have stuff in reserve. If they run out, then all the saloons close. Now, here's the thing. The 15-gallon Act did not affect rich people who bought they could buy a bottle of, liquor and they could drink that at home. Which is kind of interesting. Like, I was actually talking to somebody about the 15-gallon Act yesterday because, when you look at the government closing my neighborhood pool, it's like somebody who can afford their own pool, they can still go swimming. Those of us who have a neighborhood pool, we can't go swimming. So you've got that kind of similar sort of thing there that, people who, have means are definitely, they're having a different experience, than people who aren't quite so well off. So when you look at this, the Jacksonians didn't tend to support things like, temperance, abolitionism, and that sort of thing. Now, of course, when we think about abolitionism, that's going to be a dividing thing between, Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs. And of course, you've got Northern Free Soilers as well. Now, the Constitution, again, with like Hamilton, Henry Clay saw loose construction, okay, that this is something that, is loose construction. Now, the Jacksonians believed in the Jeffersonian strict construction of the Constitution. And when Jackson did his issued his bank veto, I was about bank veto, right? His bank veto, he mentioned the Constitution, the rights of the states, that there's nothing in the Constitution that allows for this organization to exist, whereas Henry Clay is thinking in terms of implied powers, and this could be helpful and that sort of thing. Okay, so then going from, oops, I kicked my tripod. Got to get that back set up. Just give me just a second. There we go. All right. So the economy, government involvement in the economy is fine, okay, for the government to intervene, whereas the Jacksonians tended to be laissez-faire. Now, the Whigs were supported mostly, their base of support was in the Northeast. Now, keep in mind, there were Southern Whigs, but the Whig Party always had a hard time outside of the Northeast being a majority party, whereas the Jacksonians were more, more popular in the South and the West. And we want to understand the legacy of the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, why Democrats were more, were more likely to support Manifest Destiny, because the farther south and the farther west you go, the more popular the Democratic Party tended to be. Now, the other issue here is going to be the American system. Henry Clay's American system: national bank, internal improvements, and protective tariff. Okay, the national bank, internal improvements, and the protective tariff. So when we look at this, yes, yes, and yes, of course, that's the American system: national bank, internal improvements, protective tariff. Now note NIP, okay, NIP. So, our economic problems are, all of that, we're going to nip it. Now, also, you could say PEN, but the only thing about PEN is there's also PEN. So I think that if you're thinking about the American system, I always use NIP. Okay, and then no, 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 kind of like Margaret Thatcher talking about the European Union in that speech some of y'all may be familiar with, I don't know. But no, 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 that basically the Democrats did not support a national bank. They did not support federally funded internal improvements. And, while there were some pro-tariff Democrats, the party as a whole was divided on that issue. Whereas the Whigs were pretty, unanimous almost in their support of manufacturing. Now, what we want to note about is the Whigs were divided on the issue of slavery between North and South, whereas the of course, the Democrats will be too. Some of the first members of the Republican Party were old Northern free soil Democrats. But note that the tariff issue, to an extent, divided the Democrats, but the Democrats always had a power base in the South, where they were very much anti-tariff. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and take a look here. Emily's wanting to know, what was the Free Soil Party? Okay, so the Free Soil Party was a political party that formed briefly in the antebellum period, dedicated to the idea of free soil. Now, when we think about abolitionism, okay, so when we think about abolitionism, abolitionism is a moral campaign, that we want to get rid of slavery because it's immoral, because God doesn't like it. And so what the Constitution says or anything like that, it's immoral, God doesn't like it, it needs to be gotten rid of everywhere and now. Free soilers were much more practical. The Free Soil Party, it's like when you tie this in with Manifest Destiny, that the Free Soil Party said that we want, essentially, what I typically say is a white West, okay, that they didn't want to compete with slave labor in the West. Now, you look at the Homestead Act, which was passed in 1862. The 1862 Homestead Act was an act of Congress that gave 160-acre homesteads in the West to farmers. And so they wanted free farmers to be out there in the West and in the Great Plains. They didn't want to see that open to slave labor. Now, the thing about free soilers, again, more practical. They didn't seek radical change. They didn't think that like, oh, well, we have to do this because God wants this. Abraham Lincoln was a free soiler. And by all appearances, it looks like Abraham Lincoln wasn't really all that, when you look at his first and second inaugural address, like he became much more religious, it seems, during the Civil War. And when it comes down to it, the free soilers, they were just wanting, we don't want slavery in the West, but we're not going to say anything about slavery in Alabama. Like, for example, you can see some early, before it was even called free soil, when you look at the Missouri Compromise, there was resistance with the Talmadge Amendment. There was resistance to the Missouri Compromise, there was resistance to Missouri as a slave state. Now, while all of the debate was happening in Missouri, Alabama was voted into the Union without fanfare as a slave state. And so, this idea that because of the location of Missouri, they should have a gradual emancipation policy. So this idea was already kind of set. This goes all the way back to the Northwest Ordinance during the Articles of Confederation. This idea that slavery should be confined to the South, okay? That they the political class, in the Free Soil Party, they believe that, okay, slavery is part of the Southern economy. Now, understand as well that before the Civil War, the Southern economy was the backbone of the national economy. And so that's why when you look at the Republican Party, which was a pro-business party, they wanted a national bank, they wanted protective tariff, they wanted internal improvements. Or I got that out of order, right? Because I like to do the nit thing. But this whole idea of the American system that we want a stronger central government, but they called for free soil. In the 1860 Republican platform, they did not call for abolition. That you don't see that until the 1864 Republican platform. So that's something to note, that the business interest on the more like, moderate to conservative side of the Republican Party, they understood, like, we want northern manufacturing. We want those northern textile manufacturers to be supplied with southern cotton. And so you don't see, with the free soilers, they're just saying, I don't want to be around it, which that's something, when you think about like out of sight, out of mind, there are, today just horrible things going around all over the world. We don't see them. We don't really think about it. So that is the essence of the free soil movement. If there are any other questions, let's get those in because we are running short on time. Now, I want to remind you of the We the Students essay contest. Now, that's got a deadline in a couple of weeks on April 15th, but this would be a great opportunity to win some money. The Bill of Rights Institute is going to put a link there into the chat. Okay, so as far as that goes, what about the anti-slavery movement in regard to this time period? So Versi, when we want to think about anti-slavery movements, okay, movements. So movements, when we think about abolitionism, but also thinking about free soil. So understand that to be anti-slavery was not necessarily to be an abolitionist. To be anti-slavery could also mean to be free soil and to be anti-slavery in that sense. So if you go to the Bill of Rights Institute, and I think you can even type in wethestudents.org, but if you go to Bill of Rights Institute, you will see here, what does civil discourse mean to you? So click on that link there, and what does civil discourse mean to you? And of course, when this is posted, there may be a link there, but yeah, if you're here right now, go ahead and click on that link. It's a great chance to win some money. I mean, imagine if you were able to tell your family, like, hey, President Trump may have sent you a check for, $2,900, but look here, I've got $7,500. Okay. So, I mean, that's something that, that's a lot of money. So I would strongly encourage people to enter that essay contest. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will be back again. It'll be on the 14th of April. On Tuesday, April 14th, we'll have webinar number 7, and we will get into causation in the Civil War. Okay, so talking about the causes of the Civil War. Now, focusing on the LEQ is our plan, but again, there are going to be some announcements made, sometime between tonight and tomorrow, and we're going to know the format of the exam. So some of the content may be subject to change, or just as far as how I'm going to do it. But again, y'all have a good week off. Of course, if you're having spring break along with me, enjoy that. If you're not having spring break, remember to do your online assignments. And I will look forward to seeing y'all on April 14th. And I will make sure to bring the mug next time. Okay, so I don't always have the mug when I'm live, but I will make sure to have a mug next time for y'all. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude this broadcast. Thanks for joining us, and it's always a pleasure.